Chapter 19. The Dynamic Forces of the Mind. It has now been shown that the subjective entity possesses all the mental equipment necessary for an enjoyable existence as a purely intellectual being, without being the possessor of any of the faculties which have been designated as belonging exclusively to the objective mind. It may be remarked, in passing, that the possession of the intuitional faculty alone would, to the disembodied soul, constitute practically the Buddhistic nirvana, and would doubtless nearly approach the ideal of the average yogi, who begins his search for divine illumination by severing every domestic tie, repudiating every social obligation, suppressing every human emotion, and strangling every human affection, and pursues his quest for truth by sitting on his haunches, thinking about himself, and trying to stare his umbilicus out of countenance. He seeks for emancipation from every human passion, and contemplates with calm indifference the prospect of the annihilation of his individuality. He longs for absorption into the deity, for rest in nirvana. It is, perhaps, not strange that the average Hindu should regard absolute rest as the acme of human felicity. His climate, his social and political environment, his diet, his habits of body and of thought, the fauna of his native land, and the character of his Western proselytes, all have a tendency to aggravate that feeling of weariness which seems to involve both body and soul, and to be congenite with the whole Oriental race. The Hindu philosophy of a future life is based largely, if not wholly, upon an observation of that one faculty of the subjective mind to which I have just alluded, that is to say, the salient feature of the subjective phenomena of the yogis. Etid genus omni consists in entering that hypnotic state known as ecstasy. In that state they become illuminated, as they term it, and they imagine that they come into direct communion with the deity, and that they are put in possession of all knowledge, and a large share of the deific power. In short, they identify themselves with the deity in imagination, and they come to the conclusion that they have penetrated the secret of a future life, and are enabled to define its conditions. Now, although there are as many different sects in India as there are in Christendom, and although their views are as widely diverse regarding non-essentials, yet they all agree upon one point, namely, that the ultimate destiny of man is to be absorbed into deity, and identified with him. In the Buddhistic philosophy, this means utter annihilation of individuality. Of course, the different sects hold diverse views even on this point, but this seems to be the general trend of both the Brahmanist and the Buddhist doctrine of a future life. That question, however, is unimportant for our present purpose. The significant point is that they have arrived at the general conclusion, from an observation of the phenomenon of ecstasy, that soul is ultimately absorbed into the deity, and thereby comes into possession of all knowledge, power, and dominion. Now, that condition is identical with the one in which the faculty of intuitive perception or cognition of truth is oftenest observed. It is seen in other states or conditions, to be sure, from that of apparent normality up to ecstasy, but the last condition is the one in which it is most frequently observed, and it is the one in which it can be experimentally reproduced. It is doubtless true that the Indian adepts have occasionally found that some of their intuitional perceptions could be verified, as by some mathematical process, or the faculty of telepathy may have been developed, and the information obtained in that way may have occasionally been found to be veridical. A few circumstances of that character would inevitably lead that class of minds to the conclusion that all impression felt while in the ecstatic condition were revelations of divine truth. I say that conclusion would be inevitable, just as the phenomena of spiritism has inevitably led the same. Class of minds to the conclusion that they are produced by spirits of the dead. But this must be said in extenuation of both conclusions, namely, that until the law of suggestion was discovered, there was no other rational hypothesis which could explain all the phenomena. In the meantime, there were but two paths open to the scientific mind. One was to accept the phenomena for what they purported to be, the other to deny their existence. To explain them on scientific principles, in the absence of any knowledge of the law of suggestion or of the power of telepathy, was impossible. These discoveries, however, have changed the whole aspect of the questions involved, and relegate the visions of ecstatics to the category of subjective hallucinations induced by suggestion. If anything were needed to demonstrate the proposition that ecstatic visions do not reveal scientific truth, it would be found in the fact that there are many different sects in the Orient, each of whose doctrines is based upon the phenomena of ecstasy. and yet they are so divergent that they are scarcely recognizable as springing from the same root. Surely, if ecstatic visions reveal divine truth, there can be no room for difference of opinion among those favored mortals to whom it is thus revealed. The truth is that the whole of the vast fabric of Oriental philosophy is based upon psychic phenomena produced in utter ignorance of the law of suggestion, and as that law is fundamental, universal, and never failing in its operations so long as the soul inhabits the body, it follows that Hindu philosophy is destitute of any scientific value whatever. The ever-ready answer to this is the declaration that in the ecstatic condition the subject is lifted into a higher spiritual realm, where he is exempted from the laws which govern ordinary mortals, where the law of suggestion no longer prevails, and where all truth stands revealed to the disenthralled cosmic consciousness, whatever that may mean. In other words, they simply beg the question. It is noticeable that the Oriental ecstatics have many and a constantly growing number of feeble imitators in the Western world, who are assiduously practicing self-hypnotization with a view of coming into conscious communion with the deity, etc. They too are instructed that in the higher spiritual realm, they are exempted from that inconvenient law of suggestion which prevails so extensively among less favored mortals on the lower psychic plane, and that consequently their visions are veridical, their imaginings are the essence of divine truth imbibed directly from its divine source. It is useless to remind that class of minds that all the facts of psychic science conspire to demonstrate that the law of suggestion is the universal, ever-present, all-potent factor which governs the manifestations of the soul so long as it retains its connection with the body. It is useless to challenge them to produce one fact that militates against that proposition, for scientifically verified facts are not to their liking when such facts do not harmonize with their emotions. It is a thankless task to warn them that such practices are abnormal to the last degree, destructive to the nervous organization, weakening to the objective intellect, and, instead of being promotive of spiritual growth, constitute the direct path to spiritual imbecility. It is even useless to try to encourage them by explaining to them that the faculties which they are trying to use amidst the trammels of the flesh and the limitations of the law of suggestion are faculties which are normal only to a future life, when the soul is freed from its earthly limitations and is thereby enabled to exercise those intuitional powers of perception which belong only to a realm of truth. They are not content to await their allotted time, but rush unbidden to the gates of heaven, determined to penetrate the secrets which Jesus withheld from all mankind, and which must forever remain a mystery to incarnate man. I remarked, in the beginning of this digression, that the possession of the intuitional faculty alone would, to the disembodied soul, constitute the Buddhistic nirvana. I mean by this remark that, if this faculty of the soul constituted the only one which it carries with it into a future life, it would correspond exactly with the Brahmanist idea of the status and capacity of the perfected soul. It would be a purely intellectual being, destitute of emotion, and therefore divested of all human interest or affection, bereft of memory, and therefore of individuality, and possessing only what is vaguely termed a cosmic consciousness, which seems to have reference to nothing of human interest if it has any definite meaning whatever. We might well suppose such a being to be destined to be absorbed into Brahm, without either loss to itself or material gain to Brahm. To the Western mind, accustomed to regard a future life as one fraught with human interest, such a destiny would be regarded as equivalent to utter annihilation. It becomes important, therefore, for us to inquire whether there is anything in the structure of the subjective mind to warrant a conclusion so repugnant to every normal emotion of the human soul. In pursuing this inquiry, the first question which naturally arises is, what is the primary and most essential attribute or power which man, constituted as he is in this life, most naturally desires his soul to possess as a means of enjoyment in a life to come? Clearly, the answer of every normally constituted person would be the retention of conscious individuality. It is obvious that all other enjoyments depend upon that. Any condition, minus the personality, would be the equivalent of annihilation. What a man is and has in himself, says Schopenhauer, in a word, personality, with all it entails, is the only immediate and direct factor in his happiness and welfare. This, in the very nature of things, must be as true of a future life as it is of the present. If, therefore, it can be shown that the soul has the means and the power to retain that personality, it will be seen that the great factor in man's happiness and welfare will be present in a future life. The three essential prerequisites to the retention of personality are 1. Consciousness, 2. Memory, and 3. Will. Consciousness and memory are the two coordinate, concomitant factors which constitute the personality of each individual, so far as he himself is able to realize it, or to take cognizance of his own existence as a distinct entity. Consciousness is the state of being aware of one's existence and of one's mental acts and states. Memory is the faculty of the mind by which it retains the knowledge of previous thoughts or events. Without memory, there could be no possible retention of personality. What is known of the sum total of a man's experiences and qualities constitutes his personality as it is cognized by others. What one remembers of those experiences constitutes his personality as cognized by himself. It follows that one's personality is more or less pronounced in proportion to the retentiveness of his memory. Just as one is distinguished in the estimation of his fellows in proportion to what is known of his characteristics as shown by the known events of his life. If, therefore, the memory and the consciousness should be blotted out, the being might sustain an existence, but it would be purely vegetal. The personality would remain only as a memory of those who knew him, but, so far as the individual would be concerned, his condition would be the equivalent of annihilation. The intelligent reader will have anticipated me in what I am to say regarding the perfect memory of the subjective mind, and the conclusions derivable therefrom. As the perfection of subjective memory has been again and again demonstrated, one it will here be taken for granted. The general conclusion to be derived is that the personality of the soul will be as much more pronounced than that of the objective, physical human entity as the memory of the former exceeds that of the latter. Again, the reader must be reminded of the fundamental axiom upon which this argument is based, which is, in brief, that there is no useless faculty of the human mind. It will then be pertinent to inquire what possible function a perfect subjective memory can be supposed to perform if it is not what has been indicated. It must be remembered, 1. That the objective mind possesses a power of recollection which is all sufficient for the uses of this life. A perfect subjective memory has, therefore, no function to perform in the intellectual processes of objective existence. 2. That all exercise, on the physical plane, of the powers of the subjective mind are abnormal and productive of untoward results to the physical frame. It has, therefore, no normal function pertaining to physical life. The question then arises, what function can it perform in a future life? Clearly, it is not a necessity as an aid to the intellectual processes of the soul, for that has been shown to possess the inherent power of intuitional perception or cognition of all truth. It would, therefore, be a faculty as superfluous to the soul as the faculty of reasoning inductively, considered solely as an aid to intellectual development, and for the same reason. There remains but one other direction in which we can look with reasonable hope to find a normal function for perfect subjective memory. In that direction we find three functions, two of which are concomitant and obvious, and the other is inferential and speculative. The first is what has already been indicated, namely, it enables the soul to retain its personality. The second is included in the first, namely, it enables the soul to recognize its friends, and, inferentially, to resume social relations at will. Here, then, are ample functions for the memory of the soul, and they are of weighty import in more senses than have been named, but these will be reserved for future consideration. It is sufficient for the present to have shown that the soul has the prerequisite faculties for the retention of its personality, and it remains to ascertain if it also possesses the motive force necessary for the purpose. The third prerequisite named is will. Will is a motive force. It chooses when stimulated by desire. It has its biological origin in desire. One's will, therefore, is strong in proportion to his desires regarding any particular object, and, other things being equal, his ability to accomplish a particular end is in exact proportion to his strength of will, or desire to do so. Without will, therefore, nothing can be accomplished. It is this which distinguishes the man from the brute, that is to say, it is one of the factors which count for immortal life in man, but which is totally absent in the brute. The man wills to retain his individuality after the death of the body, and he alone has the power and potentiality of a self-existent entity. The inchoate soul of the brute has no conception of a future life, and hence no desire, no will to enable him to retain his individuality and no consciousness of the possibility of any but a physical life. The strongest desire of the human soul is to retain its personality. It is instinctive. That is to say, it is the extension of the instinct of self-preservation to a future life. It is the higher manifestation of that instinct, the primary function of which is the preservation of the body, but which belongs equally to the soul and performs its higher function in the preservation of its personality. Jesus expressed, in the strongest possible terms, the strength and intensity of human desire when he said, "What shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" If anyone doubts the intensity of the desire of the normal man for the retention of his personality, let him try to think of some living person with whom he would be willing to exchange personalities. It is doubtful if there is a person so utterly miserable and unfortunate that he would be willing to blot out all of the memories which constitute his individuality, abandon all his hopes for the future, and accept and exchange the personality of the most fortunate person on earth. Such is the inherent egoism, not egotism, of the subjective entity. Let not this word be construed altogether in the offensive sense, for the emotion represented has a normal function to perform which is of the most transcendent importance. It is desirable at this point to understand clearly certain very important distinctions which must be drawn before the subject can be properly understood. As the dictionaries do not make the proper distinctions, eo nomine, it will be necessary to depart from the usual definitions. The word egotism being now always employed in the offensive sense, extreme vanity and self-conceit being designated by that term, it will be retained to designate the abnormal manifestation of the attribute to which I wish to draw attention. The word egoism has always been defined as synonymous with egotism, except where it is employed in reference to a certain school of philosophy supposed to have been founded by a sect of the disciples of Descartes and Fichte. But I shall press the word egoism into service to designate the normal manifestation of the attribute or faculty alluded to, partly to avoid coining a word, but principally because it happily expresses my exact meaning. I define egoism, therefore, as the passionate desire of the human soul for the retention of its personality or individuality. This represents the normal emotion and its normal manifestation, and, as before remarked, it is the strongest emotion of the human soul. Its inherent strength and persistency is made apparent to common observation in the fact that it manifests itself under all conditions of abnormal subjective mental activity. Under abnormal conditions, that is to say, when for any cause the subjective mind is in control, it is the one never-failing characteristic emotion, dominant over every other, and as offensive in its manifestations as it is colossal in its proportions. It is ever present in habitual hypnotic subjects, especially in those who are used for stage exhibitions. It is chronic in adepts, spirit mediums, and criminals. It assumes colossal proportions in actors, artists, poets, and musicians. And it is the salient characteristic of hysteria, genius, and insanity. Nor is it confined to the classes named, for it characterizes all who for any cause allow the subjective faculties to attain undue prominence in earthly life. These are its abnormal manifestations, and they are abnormal simply because they are manifested under abnormal mental and physical conditions. This is egotism in its offensive sense, and it is the primary, fundamental emotion which, uncontrolled by objective reason, leads to immorality, vice, crime, and insanity. It belongs exclusively to the subjective mind. The corresponding attribute of the objective mind can be appropriately designated by no other term than that of self-respect, which is concomitant with reason, and springs from a consciousness of rectitude and of power equal to all legitimate demands. It is that regard for one's character which manifests itself in abstention from the performance of unworthy actions. It is always normal when controlled by reason, but when reason ceases to perform its legitimate functions, the subjective mind usurps its place in this respect as in every other. And egotism in its most offensive sense and form is the inevitable result. These, then, are the distinctions which must be constantly borne in mind when considering this most important mental attribute of man. That it is of the utmost importance is manifest from the one fact alone, which has already been alluded to, that egoism bears the same relation to the psychical or spiritual entity that what is known to common observation as. The instinct of self-preservation bears to the physical man. The one preserves the soul, the other preserves the body. It is, in fact, the one instinct of self-preservation manifested on both the physical and the spiritual planes. On the physical plane, it has as many ways of manifesting itself as there are dangers threatening the safety of the body. On the spiritual plane, there is but the one way for it to manifest itself, for there is but one possible danger that threatens the existence of the soul, and that is the loss of conscious personality. The acts and motive power preservative of the physical life are dynamic. The power preservative of the spiritual life is spiritual. It is the will, the initial motive force or power belonging to mental or spiritual life. Now, while being stimulated by desire, and the strongest desire of the soul being to retain its conscious personality, it follows that the one great element of potency in the soul expends its greatest energy in an effort to retain its conscious personality independently of physical conditions. It will thus be seen that egoism, which has heretofore been regarded as wholly abnormal, is, in reality, a faculty of the soul of infinite importance, having a normal function to perform which alone renders a continued existence in a future life possible. Egoism, as I have defined it, combined with faith, constitutes the mental dynamics of the soul. Without it, the soul would be in much the same condition as the body would be in the absence of the instinct of self-preservation. Without the will or desire to live, without the instinct which causes the body to shrink from peril, one would be a passive victim to the myriad adverse forces of his environment. If he survived his childhood, it would be because of the watchful care of others. What would be the fate of the soul, minus its instinctive clinging to its personality, minus the desire, the will, to retain its individuality and to sustain an independent existence as a distinct entity? What, in short, would be its fate in the absence of the dynamics of the mind, can only be determined by logical deduction. Thus, if faculty implies function, the absence of faculty implies the absence of function. If the possession of legs implies the ability to walk, the absence of legs implies the antithesis. The argument on this branch of the subject now stands thus. 1. The essential prerequisites to the retention of personality are a. Consciousness, b. Memory, c. Will. 2. The soul has a perfect memory, which performs no normal function in this life, and is superfluous in a future life, considered merely as an aid to intellectual work, in view of its power of intuitional perception. 3. Corollary. Its ability to remember the facts of its experience can have no use or object other than that of the retention of its own personality and the recognition of other personalities. 4. Since memory presupposes consciousness, the latter must be presumed to be as perfect as the former. 5. Will constitutes the initial motive power of the human mind and soul. 6. Will has its biological origin in desire, and egoism, the strongest of human emotions, is the desire of the soul to retain its personality to be saved from annihilation. 7. Corollary. The soul possesses all the mental powers necessary for the retention of its personality and for the maintenance of an existence independently of the body. It will thus be seen that the subjective mind, or the mind of the soul, possesses all the mental attributes which constitute what may be termed the purely intellectual dynamics. It remains to consider another power, peculiarly its own, which demonstrates the actual possession by the soul of a kinetic potency which for the present cannot be classed as intellectual. I refer, of course, to its power to move ponderable bodies, otherwise known as the power of levitation. It is that power which, in spiritistic circles, produces raps upon floors, walls, and furniture, levitates the medium, tilts tables, and sometimes causes the most orderly and dignified parlor furniture to cut fantastic tricks before high heaven. Of the existence of this force no one who has investigated the subject pretends to doubt. It has been investigated by many of the ablest scientists of the world, notably by Professor Elliott Cowes of Washington and Professors Crookes and Lodge of London, besides many other scientists of lesser note in Europe and America. Professor Cowes has given it a name, telekinesis, and writes on the subject learnedly and interestingly, as he writes on every subject which he handles, and Professor Crookes has given the world a very learned disquisition on the topic. Whilst Professor Lodge has exhausted the resources of human ingenuity in devising tests demonstrative of the existence of the force and of the English language in describing them. Spiritists, of course, have an easy way of accounting for it by referring it directly to spirits of the dead. But no scientist has been able to do more than to enable us to say that it is a power belonging exclusively to the subjective entity, that it performs no normal function in this life, that it requires a physical basis in order to produce phenomena cognizable by the objective senses, and thus, like all other psychic phenomena known as spiritistic, it is never produced except as a result of the most intensely abnormal physical and mental conditions. In reference to the claims of the spiritists, it need only be said that there is no valid evidence whatever that disembodied spirits either do or can produce the phenomena of telekinesis. The only thing that can be said of the power with certainty is that it exists, that it is not a power of the objective mind, that it is a power of the human soul, and that it is valuable in this life only as an evidence that there is a kinetic force resident in the soul. It will readily be seen, however, that the bare fact of its existence as a factor in the organism of the soul is of the most transcendent interest and importance. Although we may never know in this life all that it implies when it is exercised in the future life, nor is it important that we should know, but it is of the utmost importance that we should know that the soul is possessed of kinetic force, for it completes the chain of evidence necessary to demonstrate the fact that it possesses the power and potentiality of a self-existent entity. It is simply impossible to conceive of an intelligent organism minus kinetic force, for no matter how ethereal or imponderable the soul may be, measured by physical standards, it must be supposed to possess the power of moving or causing motion, suitable to its environment. Besides, if, as we must suppose, the soul is a spark of the divine intelligence, it must be invested, in some degree, with the potential energy and hearing and omnipotence.